Words like hooligan, disgraceful, senseless. You're not smart, stupid. All these words are, of course, familiar to us from childhood.
You're being watched, even by the dead, and unburied ones, by the way.
How we dragged these cast iron radiators, bathtubs on ourselves.
As far as I remember, there were constant fights.
And it was indeed quite a rough game because we pretended to be military, organized groups. And we were very proud that we lived like this and that we had such a wonderful childhood. Childhood in the Soviet Union cannot be called ordinary. It had many good aspects, but of course, it also had many bad ones. Watch this video to the end and compare our childhood with yours. So what was childhood like in the USSR? Let's talk about that today. Our life in society began exactly at 1 year old. That's when our parents would send us to childcare facilities, the so-called kindergartens. Our mothers couldn't afford to raise us for as long as they wanted, as everything was related to payment. The Soviet Union couldn't function without female labor. It was a crucial component of the Soviet economy. Therefore, everything was designed to get women back to work quickly. Maternity benefits, the so-called maternity leave, was paid for only 112 days, 56 days before childbirth and 56 days after. Until the child turned 1, such a tiny sum was paid that women were eager to return to work themselves. From 10 months old, we were prepared for kindergarten, as it was recommended to stop breastfeeding at exactly 10 months. And for the remaining 2 months, we were taught to eat regular food and develop toilet skills. So, what was kindergarten? It consisted of 3 groups. The junior group, nursery, from 1 to 3 years, the middle group from 3 to 5 years, and the senior groups from 5 to 7 years. Each group had its own teachers who were responsible for our upbringing. So each of us remembers kindergarten for as long as we can remember ourselves. The structure of kindergartens was remarkable because it focused primarily on instilling discipline and maintaining our health. To give credit where it's due, Soviet kindergarten was first and foremost about proper routine. We were brought to kindergarten at 8 a.m. and stayed until 6 p.m. In large cities, where parents couldn't pick up their children by 6 p.m., there were round-the-clock kindergartens, a 5-day system. On Monday, children were taken to kindergarten, and on Friday, they were picked up for Saturday and Sunday to spend time with their parents. Regarding nutrition and child health in kindergarten, it was primarily about healthy and balanced meals: breakfast, lunch, afternoon snack, and dinner. We were periodically given yeast drinks, mandatory vitamins, and the universally disliked cod liver oil. And of course, we were constantly under medical supervision. Before joining our group each morning, we were always examined by a medical worker who was mandatory in every kindergarten. Groups had 20 to 25 children, and from day one, we were taught discipline. We went for walks strictly in formation, in pairs, holding hands. Whether going to eat or anywhere else, we only moved with permission and in a specific formation. We only played when allowed, and only with toys we were permitted to use. Of course, we were all children, so disobedience and childish pranks were inevitable. But from early childhood, these were punishable. From our earliest days, we knew that if you did something wrong or took a toy you weren't allowed to play with, we had displays with beautiful toys that couldn't be touched, or if there was a conflict between children, it was punishable. The punishment involved standing in a corner, known to the entire group, facing the wall for a certain time. The teacher would always say, "This child is not good. He's standing in the corner because he did such and such." Another punishment that many children experienced was being made to sit on a chair while all the other children played and did activities like drawing. While you had to sit silently on that chair and regretfully watch the others play.
Kindergarten if I take my personal experience, was filled with conflicts. Nothing but conflicts. As far as I remember, there were constant fights. I even have one photo, my only photo from kindergarten, and it was taken right after a fight.
Of course, our childhood had holidays too. The three main holidays in the Soviet Union were November 7th, October Revolution Day, New Year, and May 1st, Socialist Labor Day. These became our morning celebrations: Autumn Festival, New Year, and Spring Festival. They didn't explain the ideology to us yet, but they were already accustoming us to these holidays. We were given poems to memorize, learned dances, and photographers took our pictures. These celebrations, these children's morning parties, were our first experience of some kind of special occasion. From early childhood, we were taught ideology, a certain image. For us, it was Grandpa Lenin. His portrait hung in our classroom, in the assembly hall where our celebrations took place. And Grandpa Lenin, his image with those kind eyes, was instilled in us from our earliest days. I'll continue further because regarding Lenin, our entire childhood was connected with him. So the Soviet preschool institution was indeed very intelligently formed, very well organized, and everything in it was thoroughly thought out. Of course, the most significant impression and the most important event in our childhood was the first day of school, September 1st, when we began our school life. The Soviet school was a 10-year education system divided into 3 stages: first through 3rd grade, elementary school; 4th through 8th grade, middle school; and 9th through 10th grade, high school, which, by the way, not everyone could enter, but more on that later. For any child, 1st grade was a highly anticipated event, as we all knew we were finally beginning our long-awaited adult life. From 1st grade, we had a constant person with us for 3 years, our first teacher, whom literally everyone who attended school remembers, because she showed us that adult life had begun. The first teacher had a lot of responsibility, as she taught us everything. Of course, primarily literacy, reading, writing, arithmetic, but she also taught us the very first basics of adult life. While in state childcare institutions, kindergartens, we were just children who needed to be cared for so we would grow up manageable, well-behaved and healthy, it was in 1st grade that they began to treat us as adults, because that's when they started approaching us from an ideological education perspective.
You know, when you sit in class at your desk, there's the blackboard. Above the blackboard is Lenin. To the side is Lenin. And behind you is a bust of Lenin. You sit there thinking, you're definitely under surveillance. Definitely under surveillance. I didn't really understand it then, but now I look back and remember. I think, well, there's no escape. You're being watched, even by the dead, and unburied ones, by the way.
Already in school, we began to understand that Lenin and the Communist Party were among the most important things in our lives because we were inducted as Oktobriata. What is an Oktobrionok? It's a children's community that already had its first rules. The rules for Oktobriata: we had to be obedient, we had to be neat, we had to listen to our elders, we could never complain, and had to try to solve all our problems ourselves. Yes, this was a very important component because we weren't supposed to bother our parents with our problems. Our parents were supposed to be fully dedicated to work and take care of us by providing a home, comfort. Everything else was the state's responsibility. And the state taught us that from the first days of our class, We had to be completely independent. Perhaps that's why the connection between children and parents gradually disappeared completely. And many parents, accustomed to the state taking full care of our upbringing, only cared about two factors and asked us only two questions. How are your studies? How is your behavior? That's it. And once a week, of course, we had these diaries that stayed with us for all 10 years, where teachers wrote their comments. You really had to do something terrible for our parents to be invited to school. Mostly everything was resolved within the school, within the class. So in the lower grades, we were all octabriata for 3 years, little red stars with a kind and smiling Lenin. And it was this badge that began to teach us discipline. Teachers were allowed to do many things. First, because we were still small children. And since we were still in a child state from ages 7 to 10, we not only studied at school for 4 lessons, 4 hours, but we stayed with our teacher until evening because there was a so-called extended day group. The teacher could punish us. If the teacher didn't like how we started writing, they could come up and hit our hands with a pointer. If you were misbehaving at your desk, they could come and pull your ear, and such punishments. They could, for example, kick you out of class. They could bring you publicly to the center of the class and publicly call you not the most pleasant words. Words like hooligan, disgraceful, senseless. You're not smart, stupid. All these words are, of course, familiar to us from childhood.
Regarding kindergarten and school, boss and subordinates, that is, we are subordinates, we must obey, and the teacher is the boss, that is, unquestioning obedience, permeated with what you might call military, drill sergeant-like discipline. We always walked in formation. It really depressed me. Why did we walk in formation? Assemblies were also a kind of formation, another way of drilling us, really. We were still just kids, but already being trained to march in line. Like in that Pink Floyd video, Another Brick in the Wall. When I saw that video back then, in the 90s, I was looking at it and seeing my childhood, my exact childhood.
After we finished elementary school, we moved to middle school, from 4th to 8th grade. And then, from an ideological standpoint, we rose even higher. We became pioneers. What is a pioneer? It's a very important position for a child in his entire life. Firstly, we remained pioneers for a very long time. And secondly, the responsibilities of a pioneer were more serious. The badge changed. Now it showed the adult Ilyich, the face of adult Lenin. The badge was in the form of a bonfire, and of course, the long-awaited, beloved, and recognizable red neckerchief. The presentation of the red neckerchief was a very big event. The whole school would line up for a grand assembly, and all 4th grade students would solemnly have this famous red neckerchief tied around their necks by high school students, which we basically had no right to remove from then on. Already in middle school, we engaged in physical labor, namely, of course, to benefit our Soviet state. Our most famous activity as pioneers was collecting scrap metal. When we would walk around courtyards, see any metal items, abandoned strollers, find metal radiators in the trash. There was a lot related to metal. I'm surprised, of course, that despite being small children, physically not yet strong, I remember how we dragged these metal pipes, pipe scraps, how we dragged these cast iron radiators, bathtubs on ourselves. And at school, we had a collection point where we turned in this metal. This wasn't just about scrap metal, it also concerned waste paper. In the Soviet Union, print media was very developed, and everyone subscribed to magazines and newspapers. There were many books in homes, so most people, even my parents, never threw away paper, never threw away unnecessary magazines. They were always stacked in piles, tied with string, and they were waiting for us in apartments. So we were assigned certain districts, certain buildings, and we went door to door collecting this waste paper in these stacks. I remember how we carried all this. It was very hard work, it was very difficult. Paper itself is heavy, and of course it was very hard for us to do this. But that didn't stop us. It was very important to us. I think there was nothing bad about it, perhaps, but it was still difficult for children. What other help was there? Mandatory subotniks. What is a subotnik? The subotnik dates back to the early days of the Soviet state when Vladimir Ilyich Lenin declared a subotnik, the first community work, when people, we all know this image where he's with a log. We all knew it because it showed that even our leader didn't shy away from manual labor. And therefore, at the subotnik, we had to come and clean not only the school grounds, but also the area of the district in which we were located, in which we lived. That is, we were given rakes, shovels, buckets of whitewash to paint all the trees and curbs in spring. And this was also our work. Mainly, it was indeed the pioneers who did this. And this subotnik also fell on our shoulders. Most importantly, of course, regarding ideology, regarding the first things like defending the homeland, we were all, among other things, already defenders. And another well-known game that was specifically in middle school, that is specifically for pioneers, was Zarnitsa. Zarnitsa is a militarized game that took place in winter when snow fell. We divided into teams by class. And it was indeed quite a rough game because we pretended to be military organized groups. There was, of course, a lot of cruelty. There were fights, there were arguments between classes. Many even had certain injuries from this. Even I returned from this Zarnitsa with a bandaged head because I was hit in the head. As we remember now, it was fun, of course. And it was very interesting because it was really the first serious game when we ran through the snow, looked for this flag. We conquered it. We hoisted it on this snowy fortress that we built. But it was quite a cruel game. Besides studying, we already had a lot of free time because we no longer had these extended day groups like in the lower grades. And we already spent all our free time independently.
Well, in elementary school, I had the same experience as in kindergarten. Fights every day. Sometimes it felt like I was going to school as if to training. If it had continued, let's say, until 10th grade, though it didn't, I think I would have been a good MMA fighter because I was going as if to training sessions. In high school, it was different. There were conflicts and fights, but much fewer. You might fight once a week, and that was fine. All the conflicts, all the reasons were, first, I wore glasses, which was an extra reason, that's one. And second, I was overweight. And when you're an overweight child, you know, children are cruel. They always want to tell you about it, calling you fatso or lard or something like that, just fat in general. Well, what I can say is that these continued for quite a long time. The frequency of these conflicts and fights varied, but they immediately stopped right after I started playing sports. As soon as I began and got my first results, I was wrestling, even got my ears damaged. That was it. I no longer had problems. I had no opponents, only friends, and everything was good. You could even say very good.
We had many clubs, of course, knitting, drawing, model building, astronomy clubs, dance lessons. There was a very wide range of choices for what you wanted to do. Of course, sports, you couldn't go without sports. There were many sports sections. And you know perfectly well that Soviet sports were strong, and our champions were raised from childhood. But not all children attended these clubs, these wonderful schools. I personally graduated from art school. I participated in many clubs, astronomy, knitting, wherever possible. I certainly went and participated. But most, especially boys, didn't do much of this. Few were interested. Usually, these were children who didn't study very well, whom the school had, to put it bluntly, given up on, and for whom it was very important just to get through middle school to receive their first education. Therefore, these children were raised by the courtyards. What is courtyard upbringing? In Soviet courtyards, many people spent time as criminal elements. And in general, in the Soviet Union, chanson was very popular. In the Soviet Union, criminal themes were very popular. Films, bandits. Our boys loved, especially those who didn't study well, to walk around with knives, wear these caps. Criminal slang was very fashionable. And then, of course, a child like a sponge absorbed all this romance, absorbed all this. Hence the early start of alcohol consumption, early habituation to smoking. So, this courtyard upbringing is a very big topic that we will definitely address. It's impossible to just explain it to such an extent. There's a large sector there, specifically our pastime after school. So in future videos, we will definitely talk about this. And most importantly, of course, were our vacations, the time when we weren't studying. That is summertime, because from the end of May to September 1st, children were free. And in order, again, not to distract our parents from work, we had pioneer camps. We went to these pioneer camps not as children who studied in our own classes, but rather these vouchers were distributed in the trade union committees at our parents' workplaces. Therefore, children from different schools, from different districts of the city, ended up in these pioneer camps. Most of us children went through these summer camps, what they represented. The fact is that we were sent out of town, usually located in some forest area or near some specific body of water. We lived separately, boys separately, girls separately in barracks, but the camp was shared, divided into detachments, and each detachment had its own leader. Usually these were students from pedagogical institutes. We had everything there. We had food, we had leisure activities. It was all very interesting. It was all exciting because it was the first free life. But we were all, of course, under strict supervision. And the most famous and most beloved activity in these pioneer camps was, of course, the pioneer bonfire. It was depicted on our pioneer badge. This bonfire, our red neckerchief, as they told us, was the color of fire. And therefore, of course, this pioneer bonfire, when around this fire in the evening, when it got dark, we gathered in a circle, and our leaders told us stories about some heroic deeds of heroes, pioneer heroes. We learned and sang songs with guitars, well, also, naturally, with some patriotic inclination. And all this was absorbed by us. Indeed, it was very well thought out. I believe it was a very good approach, probably especially in such pioneer, such romantic settings around the campfire. It fostered precisely such, ideological upbringing, that we were still special, we were heroes. And we were very proud that we lived like this and that we had such a wonderful childhood. They always instilled in us that we lived in the best country, that we had the most wonderful childhood, that we had the best of everything, and they never even gave us the opportunity to think that this might not be the case at all. Therefore, most of us remember these moments, only the good ones, only such romantic ones. And of course, in pioneer camps, the first independent actions emerged, the first responsibility appeared, the first feelings, the first teenage love, the first mischief. We smeared each other with toothpaste, but all this was for the first time, precisely the first time of independent life. Our parents were little interested in this, of course. The most important thing for our parents was to send us away, because our parents in general, regarding raising children in the Soviet Union, were very much unburdened, because our task, I was not only a child of the Soviet Union, I was also a mother in the Soviet Union, and we were shielded to such an extent from all upbringing, shielded from these problems completely. And we never even thought, as children, and we didn't think as parents, that a child still needs more attention, and therefore sending us from school to pioneer camp was normal. And parents didn't think about it at all and gladly sent us to these camps. I want to say more, that some parents, to such an extent, you could say, were brazen that, for example, my friend, her mother sent her to camp for all 3 sessions. She spent the entire summer in these pioneer camps. When we became high school students, when we became Komsomol members, we also had certain responsibilities regarding defending our homeland and being ideologically prepared. We had one specific enemy, the entire capitalist world, and therefore we had NVP classes, basic military training. Once a week, we all wore military-style uniforms that we purchased: a camouflage-colored shirt, a tie, and a side cap. And in these lessons, we were taught our first military duties. We learned to listen to the commander. We began to understand the entire structure of military affairs. We definitely had shooting ranges where we fired weapons. And in addition, the most basic and the most difficult thing, especially for me as a girl, was assembling and disassembling the Kalashnikov assault rifle. We were introduced to it at 16, and all of us, as they say, had it in our classroom. We had to know how to assemble it, we had to know how to disassemble it and keep it clean. Regarding the relationship between adults and children, even in feature films, both children's and adults, the upbringing of children in schools or kindergartens was shown from the perspective that the most important person for a child is still the teacher.
But the thing is, there were extracurricular hours, and these activities sometimes included tea parties. I remember one well, a slightly ridiculous story. There was this tea party where they called us all together. We pushed the desks together, set out the cake, tea, tons of sweets, and started drinking and eating. Right away, we could tell the teacher was in a hurry. And since we were just kids and a bit naughty, we did everything we could to drag things out. She was clearly nervous, running around, pouring tea, handing out cakes, fussing over everything. It was obvious. She wanted us to finish fast. In the end, all her rushing around didn't help. And then, finally, she snapped. She just blurted out, "Stuff your faces faster, you idiots." I remember that moment so well. Honestly, I nearly fell over laughing. But some of the kids actually got scared and started eating in a panic. Some even grabbed food to go. Others didn't even finish their drinks. Well, that was one of those comical moments that stuck with me.
All these famous films, such as The Mustached Nanny, We'll Live Till Monday, showed that teachers and caregivers are the kindest, most necessary people in our lives. Naturally, no one cancelled the human factor, and different people came to school with completely different psychologies, different directions, and therefore each teacher had their favorites, certain children they guided. Here, social status already had some influence, while in kindergartens and lower grades, it didn't matter who your parents were, because in one class or group we had both the child of a director and the child of a plumber, and it truly didn't matter who you were. As we grew older, when we were already grown up, the social position of the child became visible. It showed in clothing. Even though we had one common school uniform, the same for everyone, there were still certain differences in appearance. If these were mainly children from large families or children of parents who earned little, they wore their school clothes for several years, even as they grew. It's no secret that when you saw children whose jacket sleeves were short or pants were too small, these were usually kids from big families who simply couldn't afford to update their clothes and wore what had been passed down from older brothers or sisters. This, in turn, significantly influenced the future lives of certain children. No matter how talented they were, very little was invested in them. It was very difficult for them to get somewhere in life, to break through, and most of these children studied only until middle school, until the 8th grade, and then went to vocational school. Still, there were many cases when these children, after finishing vocational school, entered institutes and somehow made their way in life, but that's a completely different story. Regarding ideology, let's return to that. Here we already became Komsomol members. The Komsomol is a very important milestone in the final upbringing of children, because this was already taken very seriously. Here we not only gave some oaths, but we also took exams. We were given these small booklets called the Komsomol Charter, in which we familiarized ourselves with the first rules of the communist concept. What is communism? What is the Communist Party? This was already treated more seriously. We had to know this charter by heart. Not only did we have to know it, but we also took exams. This was mandatory in the city party committee. This exam was administered by people who were already directly in the Communist Party. These were communists, and we took these exams directly in the main building of the city, the main building where the main committee of the Communist Party of the given district was located. Not everyone could pass the exams then, and if you couldn't pass it, it was very bad for you. So they took us in groups, we took these exams in turn, and then, in a solemn atmosphere, we were given the Komsomol badge. It was small, in the form of a red flag, with the face of adult Lenin, and we also had to wear this badge constantly. Another activity that appeared for us as Komsomol members was, of course, our first dues, party dues. We were already being taught that we not only, as they say, had to understand what the Communist Party was, but we also had to get used to supporting this Communist Party. So even while still in school and not yet having any earnings, we already had dues. The life of Komsomol members is, of course, a separate topic, because it's not only the life of a child teenager, it's already the life of a more adult person. We'll also talk about the Komsomol separately, because the Komsomol in the Soviet Union had a very important and very large part, because Komsomol members were not only high school students, Komsomol members were also university students. The Komsomol was the system that directly educated members of the Communist Party. We will definitely talk about this in another video. That's what childhood was like in the Soviet Union. Of course, despite all the difficulties and negative aspects, we all remember it with love. We all remember it only from the best side. After all, a child mainly remembers only the good. And therefore, for most Soviet people, Soviet childhood, school, kindergarten, pioneer camps are always remembered with love. What do you think about this? What was your childhood like? Write in the comments, subscribe to our channel, support us. This was Julie, the Soviet-born channel.
И до новых встреч!